Okay, in this chapter, we are going to talk about interaction of people, meaning interdependence and the implication of that, which actually gives us the understanding of gains from trade. So let's talk about this economy with only two goods, meat and potatoes. And there are only two types of two people in this economy. A person is called Ruby, and he actually, or this person is a cattle rancher, producing meat. And there's another person which is who's called Frank, and he is a potato farmer, and he grows potatoes. And but the thing is, both, even though Ruby produces only meat, and Frank produces only potato, both of them would like to eat both meat and potatoes. If Ruby produces only meat and Frank produces only potatoes, they can actually trade each other, meaning that Ruby sells meat to Frank, and Frank sells the potatoes to Ruby, and both actually will be better off by having such a trade. And if both Ruby and Frank produce both meat and potatoes, then both can gain from specialization and trade, meaning that they can actually specialize in what they can do best, and then they trade each other, and both of them will be better off. Now, in order to talk about these gains from trade, we'd like to talk about production possibilities frontier. It actually shows, as in the previous chapter, various mixes of output that an economy can produce. Here is an example. Well, panel A in here, it says production opportunities. Here we actually have two people, again, farmer, the Frank, the farmer, and the Ruby, the rancher. And Frank can produce an ounce of meat in 60 minutes. And in other words, actually, nobody can actually produce meat in 60 minutes. But we are actually assuming in this case is that it takes 60 minutes to produce an ounce of meat, as an example. And potatoes, it takes about 15 minutes for Frank, the farmer, to produce 1 ounce of potatoes. Now, therefore, and the Ruby, the rancher, can produce an ounce of meat in 20 minutes and an ounce of potato in 10 minutes. In this case, how much can they produce in 8 hours? If the Ruby spends 8 hours and Frank spends 8 hours, he can produce 8 ounces of meat, and if he devotes 8 hours in potato production, he can actually produce 32 ounces of meat. This is in 8 hours, amount of meat or potatoes being produced in 8 hours. Now Ruby, the rancher, however, he can produce 24 ounces of meat within 8 hours, in 8 hours, and he can produce 48 ounces of potatoes in 8 hours. Now, so we can actually see that this panel shows the production possibilities to Frank and Ruby in this case. In 8 hours, how much they can produce each of those products. Now, so therefore, we can actually construct a graph in this case, which shows the production possibility frontier for Frank and the Ruby. So these figures 8 and 32 and 24 and 48 came from the previous table which we had here. And we simply plot them for 8 hours, how much he can produce as a maximum. Each of them can produce maximum meat or potatoes. And here, so therefore, for Frank, Frank can produce 8 ounces of meat and 32 ounces of potatoes with 8 hours, and Ruby can produce 24 ounces of meat and 48 ounces of potatoes. Now, so panel B in this case shows the combination of meat and potatoes that Frank can produce. Panel C shows the combination of meat and potatoes that Ruby can produce. So here we are again assuming that the this production possibility frontiers are derived, assuming that Frank and Ruby each work 8 hours per day. So if there's no trade, each person's production possibilities frontier is also his or her consumption possibility frontier. What it means is that, okay, so for Frank, he can produce from here and here, somewhere between this line, between these 2 points on this line. They're not going to produce anything below this line because it's not going to be efficient. For example, if at this point, if we can think about, and here, this Frank is producing same amount of potatoes but less meat, and therefore he's not going to actually produce that, and therefore he's going to produce this much, and he's going to consume this much. And the same thing in a similar manner. For Frank, he can consume any point on this line. He can consume 8 ounces of meat and no potatoes. He can consume 32 ounces potatoes, no meat, or he can consume somewhere between 4 ounces meat and 16 ounces potato. In a similar manner, we can actually talk about the Ruby's case. His production possibility frontier is here, and we can actually see that Ruby can consume anywhere on this line, from here to here. If Ruby chooses to consume this point, it means Ruby is going to consume 24 ounces of meat and 0 ounces of potatoes, and similarly 48 ounces of potato and 0 ounces of meat. Now, if the Ruby chooses somewhere between these 2 points, she may choose, or this person may choose anywhere on this line, and let's assume that he chooses this point here. Then we can see that production possibility frontier line, here above this point, no, they cannot consume. Below this point, they do not want to consume. So they want to consume where they can produce. So without trade, Frank is going to produce this much of potatoes and meat and consume this much of potatoes and meat. In a similar manner, Ruby does the same thing. Okay, so here we can actually see production possibility frontier is consumption possibilities frontier, meaning how much he can consume given the resources and their productivity. Okay, now let's talk about the case here. Frank specializes in growing potatoes only. More time growing potatoes, less time raising cattle. And rancher Ruby specializes in raising cattle. More time in raising cattle, less time in growing potatoes. Then here they can actually trade meat for potato each other. Okay. Now, if they can consume in the rate as we just mentioned in the previous chapter, now the Ruby, even though this, Frank, this is production positive frontier, Ruby can and Frank can consume over here. In a similar manner, Ruby consumption with a trade, now this person is able to consume this much B star. So we can see that they can consume more of both goods if they somehow specialize and trade each other. So it says the proposed trade between Frank the farmer and the Ruby the rancher offers each of them a combination of meat and potatoes that would be impossible in the absence of trade. So in panel A here, Frank gets to consume at point A star rather than A, and in a similar manner, the Ruby can consume B star rather than point B. So both of them trade allows each of them to consume more meat and more potatoes. Now, of course, this is the based assumption that they trade at this rate: 5 ounces meat for 15 ounces of potato. Okay, so we can actually talk about summarize that case from trade here. In this case, how trade expands set of consumption opportunities. And without trade, production and consumption is going to be this much, which originally saw on the original production possibility frontier, right? Frontier. Then with the trade, in this case, Frank specialized in the production of potatoes only. Okay, and Frank does not produce any meat at all. And Ruby, in this case, he produces less potatoes and more meat. So in this case, less potatoes means that Ruby is going to relocate his time from the potato consumption to meat consumption. Okay, so originally we have to go back here. Here, the Ruby, the rancher, actually is going to consume, allocate 1 hour from potato consumptions, to meat consumptions. Then he can actually decrease the 6 ounces of meat and increase the 3 ounces of decrease the 6 ounces of potatoes and increase like 3 ounces of meat. Okay, so in this case now, Frank gives 15 ounces of potatoes to Ruby and gets 5 ounces of meat from Ruby. So this is what they get. On net here, now he's able to consume 5 ounces of meat and 17 ounces of potatoes, because he gives 32 to 15 ounces to the Ruby, so he's left with 17 ounces of potatoes, and Ruby gives 5 ounces of meat, so she gets 13 ounces left, and then she gets 15 ounces of potatoes. In total, she's going to be able to consume 27 ounces of potatoes. So here we can see that consumption after trade, actually there's been increasing consumption for Frank, both meat and potatoes. Same thing for Ruby, both meat and potatoes. So there's an increase in consumption due to specialization and trade in this case. Before we introduce the concept of comparative advantage and absolute advantage, let's pause for a couple of seconds, okay, for the time being.